Good evening, everybody. I'm Father Mark Hessian, and I want to welcome you tonight to this beautiful center here at Christ the King Parish. Father Jerry Hebert is here with us, Pat Friel, members of the staff here, and so together with our three parishes, Our Lady of Victory, Christ the King, and St. Anthony's, we're very, very happy to welcome so many of you tonight for a summer lecture. This is our fifth season, and in welcoming Father Dan Groody, whom I'll introduce to you in a moment tonight, the committee's very pleased to welcome a scholar, but also a practical theologian. You'll get every sense of what that means during his presentation, and certainly if you have a chance later on, some of his DVDs are available, and you'll get a real view, literally, into how much a practical theologian our priest lecturer is tonight. The topic, of course, could not be more germane to us as Catholic Christians. I know we have members of other churches and the temples and the congregation tonight. This could not be a more pressing topic for all of us as people of faith. We're members of faith families in the midst of the public square as Americans who are very conscious that the very conversation about migration is a charged one, and unfortunately, too often, yet another source for divisions among us, partisan divisions and divisions purposely supported by people who want to keep us a people who feel that division. Dan's lecture tonight, I'm going to imagine, is one that is similar to one I helped host for our bishop and priests several months ago. I'm sure he'll make other applications that are appropriate to the audience of the lay faithful tonight, but I bring that up as a reminder that even our bishop and priests need a chance to step back from so much partisan political discourse to be reminded of the deep human and theological realities of our relationships as sisters and brothers in the Lord. And so tonight, in a very powerful way, a way that Father Dan changed my own thinking about this, he's going to remind us that it's God who's the original migrant. And very much apropos today's gospel for Mass for today, that powerful text, "Come to me, all you who are weary and find life burdensome," the imagery that Dan evokes in his extraordinary remarks recall for us that from the beginning, God's been the wanderer on earth, looking for acceptance and refreshment, for comfort and peace. So we're very happy as pastors with our pastoral staff tonight to have such a important lecture in such an important time. We're grateful to all those who've provided hospitality. After the lecture is finished, there's going to be a time for a Q&A. I'm grateful to Sister Shirley Agnew, who'll come here. And as you know, because of Judy's good work, if you've been before, you know the routine. If not, anyone who wishes to ask a question, especially from that side, just go to the back of the room and come around and stand here and in that order, and Sister Shirley will let you pose your question. Obviously, if I could say so, Father Dan's come to us from the University of Notre Dame via New York, a little personal time with his sister in Providence, but if we could keep it to one question per person and not a question with multiple parts. It's 7 o'clock at night in his life too, and he's only had a slice of pizza for supper, not even a taste of a martini, so so we'll have Q&A, and then if I could ask you to respect that reality too, that after Q&A is over, it's over. You might want to have a hello with them, which is fine, but there's not chance afterwards for private, Q&A. That's not the nature of how we receive a speaker. If you have a question, it comes here to the microphone, and it's obviously pieces of the way Judy records the event. So our speaker tonight is a nationally and internationally respected theologian, a member of the community of Holy Cross. He's here with a great friend of his, Father Jim Phelan, who's got long historic roots with his mother in Centerville. They're able to take a lovely overnight. I teased him because of the topic and his work. He's actually staying at the rectory of the parish I'm now pastor of, Our Lady of the Assumption in Osterville, so he moved into Weano Avenue this afternoon. Not bad digs for a fellow talking to us about caring for the migrant among us. But that too is passing in his life. But We have someone who's a respected member of the faculty at Notre Dame. He's produced both written work and, as I mentioned earlier, videotape CDs, powerful films that have been recognized and displayed on a variety of ports, not the least of which is the respected PBS. So would you give Father Dan Groody a nice, warm Cape Cod welcome? Thank you.
Thanks, Father Mark, and thanks all of you for coming tonight to just learn a little bit more about this issue. And for me, it's a special privilege to come back to Cape Cod because I used to vacation here with my family when I was growing up. And so we used to go to a place on Cold Storage Beach in East Dennis. And then my good friend, Father Jim Phelan, and I used to come here while we were in formation together. So it's been 20 years since I've come back to the Cape. So I'm very happy to be here with you and to just share some reflections with you about this issue, which we know is an incredibly hot and controversial topic today. And no doubt it will be very much featured within some of the political debates as we enter into the election season. And yet as Catholics, we know that this is something very core to what we're about. In fact, recently I was at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and it's very fascinating to see how this symbol of the church in America really is so marked by immigration, because a lot of the small chapels within the basilica are all dedicated to different immigrant groups that have come here from different places at different times, and the role of the church certainly within that. So tonight I want to reflect with you a little bit about this issue of immigration and also reflect with you about the ways in which I've been working with this within my own research, but particularly how I've begun to think about this theologically. So hopefully that'll offer a different way of thinking about this than we often get in the public debate. And what I'd like to share with you today is not just more information, but also to really foster a new imagination about this. But I'd like to begin with a story. And it happened to me about 7 years ago or so. And I had gotten news that my uncle had died. And his name was Bill Groody. And he was a beloved member of the family. And he was my godfather, very dear to the clan. And so when Bill Groody died, we went back to the town where he was from in northeast Pennsylvania. And we had a funeral mass. And we paid our last respects. And then we laid the body of Bill Groody into the ground and said goodbye. And after I went home after the funeral, I opened up my email for the first time. And I was very struck by one email, which just said on the message line, "A note from Bill Groody." So my first reaction was, wow, he made it. He's wireless now, and just wanted to let us know that things were okay. So I just said, gosh, I looked at it and it said, "My name is Bill Groody," and I said, "My wife went away for the weekend," and he said, "I live out in Northern California near the Napa Valley," and he says, "I saw some of the work you're doing," and he says, "If you're ever out this way," he says, "I'd love to get together for dinner." So I said, "Look, I'm coming out to the Bay Area in a couple weeks," and I says, "Why don't we get together at my community's house for dinner?" So you can imagine this setting in any family or any community setting. I arrived late in the afternoon, and my community members knew I was coming, but they said, "Will you be here for dinner?" And I said, "Yes," and I met somebody on the internet, and I invited him over for dinner as well. So they were very guarded, and they were very suspicious about this whole thing, and thought maybe some mass murderer in Bill Groody's disguise was coming to dinner. And so a little uncomfortable at first, took a little while to break the ice, but I started saying, "So Bill, what have you been doing all these years?" And he says, "Well, I used to live out on the East Coast, and I was an NBC News reporter for the White House for NBC News Radio." And I thought, oh gosh, Bill, we used to hear you, and we always wondered whether we were connected to you. And he says, now I'm on the West Coast, and now I'm working on video productions. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. We've been doing that too. And so one thing led to another, and we started connecting the dots. We said, "Bill, we've got to get you together with my eldest relatives out east." And so we brought him back east, and we went through the oral tradition. And we found out that we were related through two brothers who came over from Ireland through Canada into the United States 200 years ago. But something happened. We're not quite sure what it was. Something happened in the family, and the best we could tell is like one married outside the clan, and you just didn't do that in those days, obviously. And so it so angered the other brother that he asked himself, he says, "What can I do to make my other brother as angry as possible?" All right, now we know this was the beginning of the Fighting Irish. It wasn't the last part of the Fighting Irish, but this certainly was one important moment. And so he says, look, I know what I'll do. He says, I'll become Protestant. So his family went with the Protestant line, and my family went with the Catholic line, and it took 200 years to get the family back together again. And so I was told later that Irish Alzheimer's is that you forget everything but your grudges, you know. So it took Bill Groody and I, a little while to get connected, but afterwards we really started having a great time, and we started working on a number of projects together, including some of the films we have back there. But Bill and I, really not only feels like a long-lost brother, but there was something that we also participated in about a year and a half ago. And it's a study, which you can do as well. And you can actually take a sample from inside of your cheeks and of your DNA and send it into the labs. And through this joint project between IBM and National Geographic, you can actually trace back your migration heritage 80,000 years. So Bill Groody and I actually did this, and the interesting thing is that it was an exact genetic match. And so this is actually the paternal lineage of Bill Groody and I, and this is the route our ancestors took for 80,000 years. All right, so this is the long journey. And so it's believed that humanity began really somewhere in this area of the Old Divide Gorge, and then they worked their way up, and our particular kind of group would have gone into Asia and then arced their way back, and so much so that 90% of the men in northern Italy, southern Spain, and then in these parts of England would have the same genetic makeup as Bill Groody and myself. And so this is the deep story. And then from there it's plausible that they would have migrated over to Ireland, which is the more intermediate story, and then they would have come over obviously to the United States 200 years ago. So, but what's fascinating about this is scientists are helping us see how migration is literally in our genes. It's so much part of our makeup that it's really the very elemental building block of who we are. In fact, there was a historian a number of years ago, Oscar Hanlon, who really set out to write a history of immigration in America. And yet he really found out that really the history of America is about immigration. And so this whole issue of immigration is kind of so intertwined with what's going on historically that it's really not something new. And it is a birth process that we're going through right now. And it's a painful birth process, but it's one that's been going on since the beginning of time. In fact, if we look at it as well, migration is not only in our physical genes, it's also in our spiritual genes as well. And so as we look at the Bible, and as we look at, from the very beginning to the very end, the biblical story is marked by migration. We can see that really from the 12th chapter of the book of Genesis. The first 11 chapters is kind of like a prehistory, a bunch of narratives and theological motifs that are introduced there. We're not quite sure where to locate it geographically. But when we get to the 12th chapter, we know exactly where we are in terms of the historical context. And so it really begins in the land of Ur. And if we actually look at the contemporary boundaries, it would be within the territory of what is now modern-day Iraq. And it was there that this first 11 chapters in Genesis is kind of like creation of the universe and the big picture. But from the 12th chapter on, it's about the creation of the people of God. And it begins with the story of one person in Abraham, and that begins on a migration narrative. So really, as the call really unfolds, we hear God saying to Abraham, leave your country, go to the land that I will show you, and you will be a blessing. So from that point on, we can really see that this theme of migration is going to be introduced in a number of different ways. So whether it's covenant, exile, return, incarnation, death and resurrection, the journey of Jesus to Jerusalem, finally his sending of the disciples into all lands, that really from beginning to end, we're going to see this theme of migration come up throughout the Scriptures. And then in the very end, we're going to see John from Patmos, from the island of Patmos, is going to be writing from exile, all about the New Jerusalem. And so what Vatican II does is it says that the whole identity of the people of God, is in fact that of being a pilgrim people. And so to be human and to be Christian is to be in movement. It is to be migrating. And so it's the very core of who we are before God. And so I'm going to expand on that a little bit, but it is ironic that in an age of globalization, we see so much change and development going on and more interconnectedness than we've ever seen before. But at the same time, we see higher walls than ever. So much so that this is really the wall that divides Jerusalem from Bethlehem right now. It's actually, Notre Dame has a campus right there, right next to Bethlehem, and this actually is in the backyard. And so this wasn't here 10 years ago, but whether we see this between Israel and Palestine, whether we see this between the United States and Mexico, whether we see this between Morocco and Spain, whether we see this between various parts of the world, this whole kind of fortress mentality is also coming up at the same time that we're growing in an interconnectedness before. So we see a movement of people across borders, goods and services across borders like we've never seen before. But when it comes to the movement of people, we're much more ambivalent about that. All right, so I'll develop this more in a moment, but all I want to do is simply kind of introduce this whole sense that this is a political, economic, and a social issue, and we've seen plenty of things about this, but it's also a theological issue. And so what do we mean by that? How do we think about migration theologically? The first level is really about the pastoral level, and it's a movement that goes like this. It's about those such as the church that have resources that reach out to those who are on the move through direct aid, through legislative advocacy, and through some kind of material support. And so many of the church documents that we read are primarily written from this perspective. And so it's an important moment of understanding theology and migration, but it's only a first moment, because there are other levels of it as well. And the second level is really the opposite direction, which is the spiritual level. And this involves listening to the inner journey that migrants go through. So what do migrants think when they cross borders, and especially those who don't have official documentation? All right, and so a lot of my work has been going to different borders, primarily along the U.S. border in Mexico, but also between Malta and Libya, Morocco and Spain, Slovakia and Ukraine, also Egypt, and coming up northwards into Europe, and listening to the stories and the narratives of people about what they go through, and what do they think, and what do they struggle with, and what would they say if they were here tonight, and how would they speak to the president of Mexico or their countries or the United States, or how would they even speak to God if they had a chance to speak to God? And so these are some of the questions that I've been looking at, and some of the ones I'll share with you tonight. But the third level is the theological level, and this brings these other two levels together, and it's a way of saying that migration is a way of thinking about what it means to be human before God. And by that I mean that somehow our life in this world is always in movement. Even the native indigenous traditions of Central America said this, that the heart is a mystical quality that's always searching. It's always moving. And it's only when we close ourselves in that we truly die. So it's within that context that we see there's something migratory about the very nature of who we are. And really working with that theologically, I think, is very, very important. So all of this has to deal with theology and migration. But tonight what I'm going to do is to really look at this from the perspective of the Eucharist. So what I'm going to do is there's 4 parts to my talk tonight. And as we know, the 4 parts are going to mirror really the structure of the Eucharist. And so the first part, the first 2 main parts of the Eucharist are the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist, that are preceded by the entrance rite and followed in the end by the conclusion rite. And so what I'd like to do is just take those 4 parts and really speak about 4 things tonight. And the first part is going to be the entrance rite, which is really to talk about some of the numbers and the statistics and the reality of migration, not simply here in the United States, but also globally. And then the second part, we're going to go a little deeper each time through the presentation. The second part is going to be to look at what I would call the liturgy of words, which is to look at the debated territory about migration. And so by that we want to look at the political landscape, the social landscape, the economic landscape, and to begin to map out different positions, and this is important, also the validity of positions that may be different from our own. The third part is then to go deeper into the terrain of the human heart and ask theological questions, and particularly to look at migration in light of a mission of reconciliation. So in that part, what I want to do is look back to the tradition of the church and say what resources from the tradition have bearing on the contemporary reality of migration, but also to take the contemporary reality and then look at that same teaching and say, how does migration give us a whole new way of understanding that tradition? And then finally, the concluding rite is going to look at the Eucharist in light of a call to solidarity. And I want to highlight in particular one liturgy that they have every year down the U.S.-Mexico border, where they actually bring the altar together at the fence between Mexico and the United States, and communities from both sides of the border celebrate one Eucharist, because it is a realization of what it means to be a body of Christ in the midst of a very divided political reality. So that's the gist of where we'll go tonight. And so this first part really is to just lay the groundwork, is to do the entrance rite. And that's to say, when we speak about the migration, what are we speaking about? And there's different classifications that are given for migrants, right? And this is not something that scholars just do in their spare time to make themselves busy or to keep themselves gainfully employed. But it's actually, the particular distinctions are very important because they have very real ramifications in terms of what kinds of legal protections people have. And so the first group is the economic migrant, who is the person who really moves between countries in search of a more dignified life through work that promises a better future. So if you were to go to the detention centers, the mountains, or the canals of the American Southwest, and you were to listen to most of the people coming across, we're talking 98% of the people coming across, and ask them, what are you looking for? Most of them say, we don't have enough to survive at home. We're making $3 to $5 a day where we live, and we are simply trying to provide for our families. And so by one of us coming across, we hope to provide education or shelter or clothing or a dignified life for our families at home. So it's an economic need. You have an economic gun at your back, you're seeking for better opportunities. Same story that happened, I'm sure, many of our ancestors coming here. But there is another category here, and this is the forced migrant or refugee. And this is a person who flees a country because what is technically defined as a well-founded fear of persecution. So if you cross the borders and you say refugee, you're processed very differently than if you're an economic migrant. This came into being through the United Nations after World War II. And there was a dawning realization of the moral failure of the human community to provide safe havens for people who were fleeing Nazi death camps and other atrocities. And so they recognized that there has to be some place where people can find a place of protection. And so these cases are rarely granted, maybe only 1% of the time. But if you can prove that by being sent back to your homeland, you will be tortured or killed, you'd have grounds for asylum. Right? Now, so countries today that might be in that category, Democratic Republic of Congo or Sudan, or other parts of that fragile democracies or governments that are falling apart in human rights violations within Africa or parts of Asia. But there's also the internally displaced person, and these are people who have been uprooted from their borders, from their homelands, but they haven't crossed international borders. So they may be like China, where there are many people moving from rural areas to urban areas in search of work, but they haven't crossed international borders. But they also may be places like Colombia, where there's between 2 and 5 million people who are internally displaced because of wars between military groups and paramilitary groups. All right, so these types would be more like refugees that haven't crossed international borders. Right, so it's a very major issue today. But lastly, and this is the darkest, these first three highlight levels of human vulnerability, but this last one speaks of really targeting people who are vulnerable for economic gain. Right? This affects between 12 and 27 million people today who are victims of human trafficking, the second largest illegal industry tied with illegal arms sales in the world. All right? So people might be lured into this through false promises of work or education, but they may be trapped into being labor or sex slaves. All right? In some cases, women or men can be forced to have sex in brothels up to 25 times a day in some of these places. And so this is a very prevalent issue right in our midst. When you have major events such as Super Bowls and World Cups and all that, literally the cartels will come in to beef up the numbers to simply kind of provide sexual services. But there are examples of child soldiering, as well as debt bondage and other things that making this an area of increasing concern. The issues within the State Department of the United States have done extraordinary jobs, I think, in terms of trying to bring this much more to the attention and to distinguish these from other groups of migrants, because here they can apply for some kind of temporary protections. But these are the broad categories. Again, sometimes these do blur at some point. People who are refugees are also seeking better economic opportunities. But the main point here is that these distinctions do matter. And I'll show why in a moment. But what's also important is to look at the scale of migration today. Right now, there are more migrants than at any other time in history. It's nothing new, but what is different is the numbers. Somewhere between 212 million or more people today are living away from their homelands longer than a year. Conservatively speaking, that's about 1 out of every 35 people on the planet, which is roughly the population of Brazil, which is the 5th largest population on the planet. But as we look at this, it's very important to know, people often ask, well, why do they come here? And why do they not just stay home? And these are a set of statistics that we work very closely with when we are doing some studies in globalization. And just to let you know that I'm a theologian by training, but I have to dialogue with social sciences, but I didn't trust my own research enough in this. So I flew back to Washington, D.C. after I'd done my research to work with some of the lead economists of the World Bank to make sure the statistics were right. And after refining them a bit, these statistics really came out with, I think were really quite striking and alarming to us. And that is that 19% of the world lives on less than $1 a day. 48% of the world lives on less than $2 a day. 75% of the world lives on less than $10 a day. 95% of the world lives on less than $50 a day. The top 1% of the world has as much as the poorest 57% of the world, and the 3 richest people in the world have as much as the poorest 48 nations. All right? Now, when we look at those numbers, and it's very important, we then begin to see migration is not the problem in itself. It's the symptom of deeper problems which cause people to move. All right? And unless we see those statistics, we only look at the symptoms and we see that as really the issue. But when so few have so much and so many have so little, we recognize that these imbalances, which are not divinely ordained, really require some fundamental reordering. And what Vatican II said is that that disorder of the world is also integrally related to the disorders within the human heart. All right? And unless there's some more fundamental conversion that goes on, then simply we cannot sort of build a more just society. But what is also important about these statistics is that we think that people are just trying to get here to the United States or Europe, and they are. But the biggest burden sharing actually is being done in the third world, where a lot of migrants come from. There is more local migration across borders, but not quite making it toward the northern hemisphere. But if capital does not go to where the people are, people will go to where the capital is. All right? Not because they necessarily want to get rich, it's just because that's where the opportunities or possibilities are. All right, so there is migration going on in other parts of the world, but the main thing is to begin to see those inequalities. Now, as we get to the more controversial issues around irregular migrants, and there's different words that are used for them, these are people who are crossing borders without papers. All right? And to give you a sense of the scale, there's about 30 to 40 million people who are living in countries without documents. 2.5 to 4 million are crossing borders each year without papers. And in Europe, this is about 5 million people, or roughly 10% of the population. Now, in Europe, in the United States, in recent years, although these numbers in the United States have gone down in the last year, there's about 500,000 people that are migrating. What we have right now in the United States is somewhere between 10 and 12 million people who are living without documents. No political process reform agenda has really brought this we can talk about building bigger walls, but we don't know what to do about the 12 million people that are here without documents. Right? But what's important here to know is that in the United States, we're primarily dealing with economic migrants, and we're primarily dealing with Latino migrants. Right? But many of those Latino migrants share the same faith as we do. And in that sense, they're often kind of, if you will, they are enriching and deepening and in some sense sustaining the churches when a lot of other people are leaving the church. In Europe, it's a very different phenomenon. It's primarily a refugee situation, and you often have Islamic or Muslim migrants coming across. And there you have a great deal of social upheaval and cultural upheaval and religious upheaval. And so I think in some sense the issues are even more complicated in Europe than they are in the United States for these reasons. But the important thing here, and the main thing I want to get